and it's time for our first panel, which is News Operations in a Changed World. Here to introduce that panel is Glenn Dixon, contributing editor for TV News Check, who will introduce his panel. Glenn?
There. Where's my gallery view? I'm used to my monitor with my gallery view. I got something up there, it's similar. Anyway, great to be here in person. I echo that. A lot's changed in the world of broadcast TV since March 2020, and perhaps no area has been affected more by the COVID-19 pandemic than news production. Today we gathered a panel of experts to discuss the impact of remote production techniques and where they see news operations heading into the future. Joining me today, from my left, are Jock Knotts, SVP and GM, Altice USA's News 12, Fabian Westerwell, Executive Director, Media and Technology for ABC News, Peter McGowan, Director of News Operations and News Technology for WCBS, and Eric Smith, Director of News Operations for the Fox-owned stations. And as Michael said, for both the in-person and virtual audience, we'd like to make this experience as interactive as possible. So feel free to ask questions to our panelists, which we'll address towards the end of the session. I'd like to start with Eric. Eric, can you talk about how your news operations have changed since the early days of COVID, and do you see these new workflows as a permanent shift at your stations?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. Like most everyone in this industry, when COVID broke out in March of 2020, we sent everyone home. We sent our equipment out. Whatever we had, we dusted off things that were in the basement, maybe that had been retired, and we just kind of threw it all into service. Clearly, over the last close to 2 years now, we worked hard to harden those systems, make them work for us, work with our vendors to find systems that really are flexible and that are agile. I think those are the key words as we work into the future, beyond COVID. A lot of what we've learned from COVID applies to business continuity planning, which is obviously front and center for all of us in this industry right now. So, for us, it's really about finding systems that can support us both in our buildings, out of our buildings, from a technology perspective, not just a hardware or a software solution, but systems that provide us with flexibility for any number of needs that we have. That's really what we're focusing on as we move forward.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail a little bit later. Peter, what long-term impact as a scramble to meet the challenges of COVID last year had on your station's day-to-day news production as you look forward into 2022?
That's a good question. I keep on going back to how it started for us and how it started for everybody in terms of, we're great at crisis and we're great at deadline. And we often don't act until a crisis or a deadline hits us right in the face. And that's kind of what happened there. And we had our base of operations ready and just kind of, exported as much as a gun to our head it was. We were the first folks in the city that were evacuated from our building, probably a good month ahead of anybody else in terms of COVID being in the building. But through partners like with my good friend Greg over there from DeGero, everybody just really responded. And that's what always amazes me, that before I would get into any kind of discussion of the tech that we're using, it's the people behind it and how dedicated they remain to this day, including in the life-threatening circumstances that they were. In terms of where we are, a lot of our folks are back in the building, and that's clearly where life is best for us. But of course, we're trying to adjust and keep looking at, once the crisis is over. Every story has a crisis and an arc. It goes here and you figure it out and there's panic and you throw all sorts of resources. Eventually it levels off, whether it's 9/11 or this. And we're well into the level off point. And probably our biggest concern right now is the overall concern that everybody has, which is connectivity. We were talking about it just before this started, the connectivity here in the Hilton, the connectivity on the Upper West Side versus the connectivity downtown. And those are where our biggest issues are in terms of pipeline and how we can maximize what's available out there to us, who's got who's got the better mousetrap when it comes to making sure our folks are connected out there and connected within the building.
Yeah, thank you. Fabian, can you talk about ABC's ongoing move to virtualized news workflows and how that will carry over to the new broadcast center the network's building downtown?
Yeah, to those earlier points, I mean, obviously the last couple of years have changed things pretty dramatically, and it's not that it's changed things that much as far as where things were headed, but that it, and a lot of people have said this, that it accelerated it, right? And for us, I think for virtualized production, the way I look at it is it's really a software-defined production environment that we're trying to head to, rather than hardware. And the three big things as part of that I look at is, accessibility is key, flexibility, Eric mentioned that, and creativity, right? So on the accessibility side, everybody now is used to working, I don't want to even say remotely. I think I heard this somewhere, somebody said that it's not really about working from home, it's working on the internet, right? And that's what people are now used to. Most of the work that I do throughout the day, and I think this is pretty much the same for most other folks, is you're on Office 365, you're on Slack, you're on Zoom. Those are all cloud applications. And they're not obviously limited or connected to any kind of physical space that you're working in. So I think for the average person that we have, including our journalists, they're now used to that kind of experience, that it doesn't matter where you are, you need to be able to access all of your tools for the most basic work that you're doing in any location. So that accessibility piece is obviously key to that. And then the flexibility part is more from the tech perspective for us, right? If we can set up the right networking infrastructure, the right storage, and the right compute, and then have that be something we can run any application on top of, and that's obviously the benefit of virtualization and all these things, then we have the ability to create as much flexibility around our ecosystem of what applications we're running and how they're interacting with each other, which is obviously a critical piece. That interop piece is something we're really focused on so that we can enable that creativity I mentioned, because that's, I think, the ultimate opportunity here, that we can run niche applications that solve very specific user needs in our stack that are best of breed, that are very compatible with the other software solutions that we use. And that's what we're building towards. And that's what we expect from our vendors, where obviously we don't want to invest in hardware native solutions, but also when it does come to software, which is obviously our focus, that it's interoperable and works well with the other applications, and we create an easy and accessible ecosystem around that.
Okay, thanks. I told you I was missing my gallery view, and I wasn't lying. My apologies to Mac. I didn't introduce Mac McLaughlin, CEO of FX Design Group, because I didn't see him down the table. But Mac, I'd like to ask, how have you seen your customer studio presentations, how have they changed over the past 2 years, in regard to the pandemic, and how do you see them evolving going forward?
Thank you. I've lost some weight recently, so I know why you couldn't see me now.
Yeah, exactly.
In the early days of the pandemic, the first calls we got were for digital background. So we sent a lot of the stations digital copies of their sets so they could use them from home if their reporters or anchors were working from home. And as it continued on, everybody thought it was going to be over in a month, and it wasn't. We received some calls for plastic partitions at the anchor desk and things like that. And really after that, there weren't many changes. As they came back to the studio, there are plenty of venues in most sets where they can stand up and socially distance, and they used opposite ends of the anchor desk versus sitting close together. And then in our early discussions on designs that were continuing on after that, everybody brought it up, should we consider this into the future? And pretty much everybody felt, no, this is going to end soon, much sooner than it has, and it hasn't. But no changes were really made to anchor desks. They didn't get bigger. We do have, I think, more venues in the studio, more video storytelling areas with large LED walls now is a big part of that. But I don't think it's really pandemic driven. It's just, I think the video walls is the next part of studio design for the future, and not really pandemic driven though.
Okay. And a follow-up to that, how much are people using virtual set technology today, or has that kind of been supplanted by the video wall technology you're talking about?
I've been a fan of virtual, and I think every studio should have an area that they can do virtual sets from, but it still hasn't taken hold. I sat in on a SVG panel yesterday on AR, VR, and that's the driving force there, but I think until there's a standardization amongst the platforms, that virtual just isn't going to get a foothold. We've actually had several clients over the last year or so who had virtual studios go back to hard sets. So until it's standardized, I don't think it's going to happen. Big video walls, everybody understands video. They understand how it works. They understand how to feed it. And as LED prices continue to come down, the walls get bigger and bigger. And I think for the foreseeable future, LED is going to drive that. And maybe AR graphics that can work in conjunction with video walls will bring virtual in, and then eventually, a smart accountant somewhere in some group will say, wow, I can save a whole lot of money if we go virtual, and now it's standardized, and now we can hire people that know how to use it. But right now, if a studio loses their virtual tech, they're lost and confused. So I think that's the biggest issue there is standardization and ease of operation and workflow.
Okay, thanks. Jock, what are some of the challenges, we were talking about how much more remote production everyone's doing. What are some of the challenges that remote production workflows present for young journalists compared to working in a traditional newsroom environment? And I say that, I know you've brought a lot of people back to the newsroom recently.
Yeah. Look, I think we've just gone through arguably the most disruptive period in the years we've been doing television news. And as nimble as we were in getting people into their basements and into their kids' rooms and all that to do their broadcasts, we had to be just as nimble as we thought back, all right, do we want to live in a hybrid world, or do we want to live in a world where people still come to newsrooms, right? And because the deadline pressure is so immediate, right, we really very quickly said we have to get back to the newsroom. As part of that, what we also discovered during that, that 18 months of darkness was that our young journalists in particular, they weren't getting all of the wisdom from the veterans because you had to schedule somebody in a Zoom or in a Teams meeting in order to be able to get that, right? So it was really important to us as we tried to figure out how do we evolve this workflow in this extremely disruptive period is the people. It's like, how do we take these younger journalists and make sure that they get the kind of nurturing about the industry, and frankly, so that we can also get their wisdom on what they learned during that period of time when all of us had to be much more nimble and figure out, well, gee, I should do all my interviews by Zoom, or I can now use all this technology to just build my own graphics, right? There was so much that was learned during this period. But I like the era we're in now, which I think is even more challenging than getting back into people's homes, because now it's like, what did we learn from all that? What are we going to take from this experience and make it part of our future storytelling and the way these newsrooms operate?
If I can jump on that one as well, the technological aspect of it obviously was easier to deal with the younger folks because they've grown up with this. They haven't known a world before. It's the ethical and the operational parts of it that we got really concerned about, almost in the sense, particularly with the really younger ones, that this is how they were learning to do things, as opposed to standing there talking to someone on camera, and then when the camera goes off, they come over, they say, hey, listen, I want to tell you a couple of things I wasn't going to say on camera, that kind of thing. Yeah. So from our perspective, and from a local news perspective, we couldn't wait to get back out there in the street, and Zoom has, I'm not going to say it's become a dirty word. It's definitely effective. If you're, I'm in the New York market, so if you're in Nassau County and your interview comes in at the last minute in Riverhead, and you're not going to make it, but you get them on the air, that's fine. But if it's, for the traditional model, the old model, if it's 10 in the morning and your interview says, yeah, come out and talk to me, we go and talk to them. And those are the kind of things that you worry about with the younger folks, and that's why I would call us aggressive about getting them with our people and back in the street, while at the same time taking advantage of what they know how to do.
And I'll throw this to Jock first, and then Peter may went. How good a job do you think the broadcast vendors have done with coming up with tools to let you help foster collaboration. You know, sort of the baseline commodity collaboration tool everyone mentions is Zoom or Microsoft Teams, but have any of the newsroom vendors, editing vendors come up with some, more tailored solutions for collaborating on editing or story planning, et cetera?
Well, look, I think this word hybrid that we've all gotten so used to in terms of the workflow, also goes into, the planning as to whether you're going to have more control rooms, which I think we've figured out, we need a lot of remote production capability, right? Which means you need the hardware and you need the cloud-based systems in order to be able, to do all that. And that flexibility that was, mentioned here earlier is really the pivot point that we're at, right? You've got to be able to have remote facilities, have that disaster relief backup, because, I know in my situation, running 7 newsrooms, you have to shut down these newsrooms from time to time to clean them out, right? Because of COVID. So that has made us much more nimble in terms of, the adversity that we've faced during COVID, to be able to still stay on the air from any location, because you never know if a place is going to get shut down. So I think we're a lot more capable of handling big things like earthquakes and blizzards and things like that can, put us in jeopardy because of what we've learned from this COVID experience.
Okay. Fair enough, thanks. Fabian, you talked before about a software-defined architecture, and you mentioned some of the high-level concept. Can you explain a little more depth what that means for news operations on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I'll come back to the creativity point, which is, I think, creativity both on the journalist side, but also on the tech side. So it's about enabling that. And so the 3 pieces that I mentioned earlier that we have to get right, is the compute, the storage, and the networking in order to get there. And those are currently the things that our production IT team are really focused on, to make sure that the media and everything else is flowing freely. And that's really, I think, a change from before, where we had the components of hardware sitting on an internal network. All those components were all not secured or had their own authentication. And now we have to focus on that. Yeah, so there's a lot of pieces to that, but sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. But at the end of the day, what we want to get to is this ecosystem where we have these different applications that are able to work together, and so that we can create a scenario where someone can sit at home and produce these events or handle media in a much more organic way.
Can I ask a question of Fabian, actually?
Yeah.
So Amazon Web Services, we all sat up and took notice last week. That kind of a failure. I'm an expert on failure, by the way. When you guys think failure, think Pete McGowan. Trademark.
No one's recording.
Yeah. What does that do to you when you see something like that happen and so many services that we all rely on go down like that? I think of that from a broadcast operations standpoint, and I think to myself, because obviously everybody's moved to the cloud one way or the other, what are you going to do when it's out for 8 hours and you still have to be on TV and you still have to be streaming?
Right. So I think, and sorry about losing my train of thought, there was some side noise earlier and it really threw me off. But I think that's exactly the key, right? So I think designing those layers I mentioned earlier with the networking and the storage and the compute, they have to be as adjacent to the architecture that we already know on the cloud side in order to enable these hybrid workflows. And I think that's the key. You have to have the ability to be able to fail over across those different layers, either if they're on-prem or in the cloud. And so, we talk a lot about a hybrid. It's that design of that hybrid that has to be really well enabled to facilitate that. Because I don't think we're ever going to want to go back to a point where we have a separate on-prem environment that we protect, and then we have a separate cloud environment that we protect, and it's not flowing. So that's the big shift, right? I don't handle our core production IT, but that team is very much focused on making that as similar of an architecture as possible. And so that means bringing like zero trust networking into our environment, and that's what I was getting at earlier. That we can't just hang hardware behind a LAN that you have to get through with a VPN. We have to run all of our applications in our environment very similar to the architecture on the cloud. So that if when we design these applications that all work together, we want to get to a point where we can have an internally built application that handles certain workflows, easily communicate and exchange media with a cloud application, and vice versa. And then so if certain parts of that fail, we have a flexible and resilient way to respond to that. And obviously, look at I know we'll get into security later, but look at what happened yesterday with Kronos and their ransomware attack, taking down all these, and that's a perfect example. Obviously, for live production, if that happened, that would be a problem. So putting all those eggs into one basket obviously is a bad idea.
Right.
But yeah, it's all about how do we create a very similar architecture to the cloud to be able to move those things between that and on-prem.
Yeah, and Fabian, besides the back-end engineering, your other goal is that the user interface is always the same, right? Regardless of where the compute's happening?
Yeah, and it's not even about it being the same. It's more, yes, I think that you can look at it both ways. It's really about creating a user experience and these applications that where the user and our producers don't care and don't know the difference, right? Mm-hmm. So and that's what I meant earlier by working on the internet. People are used to opening up the laptop and using these applications seamlessly. Usually they're web apps nowadays, right? From anywhere, and they don't need to care if they're in the building or not in the building. And that's certainly the philosophy going forward as well. And so there's certain live production applications and functions that we can't yet run quite natively that way, but that's where VDI comes in, right? So a big focus for us is to really streamline our VDI build out, make sure that the ecosystem of applications that we run on there is really seamless and creates that kind of feel for our end users. Because at the end of the day, we want to enable that creativity for our producers as much as possible. And that's, to me, really the point of a lot of this. We want to make sure, obviously, from a tech perspective, it's efficient and cost-effective. But at the end of the day, it's all about enabling that creativity for people. And they're used to working on the internet now. That's what we have to meet, that responsibility.
In prep call, we were talking about some of the big changes. One of the things was remote contributors, how much you bring talent, not talent, but people you're going to interview or regular contributors, how much you bring them into the studio, make the effort to do that versus using a remote setup at home, which a lot of people did during COVID. I mean, Eric, how much are you still using the remote contribution setups, home studio setups maybe for your talent that you set up during the early days of COVID?
Well, I think it's both things that you just said. It's our talent working from home, but then it's also the contributors that we use on a routine and regular basis. And so for our talent, we've left that infrastructure in place, but most of our talent has returned to our studios at this point for obvious reasons. The lack of delay, just that interaction, that collaboration, everything that we've been talking about. But we still want those systems in place for obvious reasons if someone were to be sick or there was an issue with the building. But beyond that as well, I'd mentioned business continuity earlier, things that we can do now, and not even truly business continuity, but things we could always do weather remotely to some degree, but now we can do it really well remotely. And so if you don't have a meteorologist in your building, you're between shifts, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon and there's going to be a tornado warning and you need to get on TV, we have the ability to do that now by having those remote studios. So I don't see any scenario where we would walk away from those even when we are fully behind the pandemic. From a contributor perspective, once again, there's nothing like a face-to-face conversation is what's great about being here today. There's nothing like having someone in the studio with our anchors talking to them eye to eye. Having said that, from a content perspective, there are interviews that we get now or content that we get that we would not have been able to get in the world prior to COVID. And whether that be through Zoom or whether that be through regular contributors that we've set up systems in their homes or at their offices or whatever the case may be. So that technology that we put in place truly just to get our anchors on TV or meteorologists has really helped us in just from a content perspective with contributors.
And Peter and Jock, have you guys had the same experience that you get a broader mix of expert commentators and other sources that you wouldn't have had before?
Well, I think the audience gets a better product because we can remote studio from anywhere. A couple of days ago, we had a storm, lasted for about an hour in the New York region, right? And we run 7 newsrooms, so we got like 20 meteorologists out there. Well, you don't have to come into the studio for the 1-hour event, because in that particular situation, we had meteorologists that were feeding in from their homes in addition to the ones that were in the studios. It's made it very easy for people to be the content contributors from any place at any time. And so, again, I think it's really opened up our ability to network content from just about anywhere, and you're only limited by your imagination as to how to do it.
I have a love-hate relationship with it, and what I mean by that is, when it was the only way to get people and talk to them, that was fine. But we're spotting people who are doing Zooms with people who are 10 minutes down the road, and there's no reason why they couldn't go and do that interview. And I think we've gotten past the Zooms where people are, looking down like this, and the hair's up the nose and stuff. But yeah, obviously, tremendous advantages if you can get someone who's central to your interview, and they're in the Midwest for the day, and you can get them, that's great. But I'm very cautious and have a lot of conversations with people saying, don't get too comfortable with this and make it get in the way of doing a better job. And to a point that was made earlier about at-home studios, we have all of our studios that we set up remotely, the anchors in their home. In theory, we think they're all ready, although I found out my weather guy's daughter stepped on his lav yesterday, so we've got to replace that. I say that with some levity, but that's probably the reality, is that it's been so long since we've done it, we would have to fire everybody up again and, block their shots and things like that. I lost my train of thought.
Well, one of the things on that is I think over time, the contributors we have, I'll pitch it back to you right after this point. But the contributors have gotten so much better and so good at being able to set up their
Sure, yeah,
setups.
absolutely.
It's changed a lot. And the other thing is with that for us is that they obviously don't have to go to studios anymore, right?
Right.
It used to, and I'm sure that's impacted that business a lot. But where it takes somebody, the booking process is, hey, can you join us on the air? Sure, it'll take me an hour to drive to the latest, closest city. That is an obvious advantage, and it's also something that gets us on the air faster and makes the entire workflow obviously much more effective. And I think we're to a point where most of the time that works really, really well for us now.
We, in terms of this getting into the second and third year of this, we're starting to run into union considerations, and I'm sure there are other folks in the room that are starting to experience the same thing in terms of someone being able to just, flip a switch into issues of, all right, well, who set it up? Did the union person set it? That kind of thing. So it's hitting that mature level in terms of, particularly in the New York market, of what we're allowed to do, and trying to make sure everybody stays happy and that the quality remains where we want it to be. But that's a significant emerging issue for us.
And Glenn, I've got a bit on that as well.
Yeah.
Something that we've been encountering now are some of your contributors who are getting a lot of those calls are now asking to build either studios at their corporate headquarters or even remote smaller studios in their home base. So we're building more studios for those people who contribute, so hopefully their product will be better for you as well. So.
And Glenn, you had asked earlier about vendor response, and I think this is one of the topics where we've seen an explosion in a positive way of vendor response around remote contributors. Zoom is free and it's great and it does what we need it to do when we need to use it, but there are vendors in this room right now and others that we've worked with that have really stepped up to find more professional solutions to make the quality better, to help with check-in of guests, to take that off the plates of our employees and to make it easier at a higher quality. So I think that's one area where the vendor relationship has really helped.
Yeah, and as a vendor up here, maybe I can say this for all the vendors in the room, the one thing we found is that most timelines for new sets facilities have lengthened quite a bit due to the supply chain. And I know you report on it every day, but you may not be aware of how it impacts. But it's probably adding anywhere from 8 to 16 to sometimes 24 weeks to what would normally be a 12 or 16-week process, just depending on is it LEDs from China or lighting from Japan or whatever. Those things are impacting it as well. So as a vendor, speaking for the vendors here, please be patient with us. We're doing the best we can to deliver as fast as we can.
Yeah, fair enough. We just bought a couch that I'm getting in April, so I can relate to that. Peter, you talked about your desire to have people do the interview in person, whenever possible. Obviously, there's still skittishness about COVID. I mean, that's why we're all sitting here wearing masks almost 2 years after this started. Have you developed any new technology for handling socially distanced interviews in the field, and is there anything that you're doing from a connectivity standpoint, too?
I mean, the first question, the new technology is as old as the hills. We went out and brought broomsticks. And, we attached the stick mics to them, and we grabbed Clorox wipes. And one of the things that there's obviously different types of broadcasters. Local news is all about being out there in the street and talking to people, but not live. So we have that luxury of being able to cut those bites up as opposed to talking heads. And so, if I was working for a 24/7 operation where a lot of it is guests, then it would be a different scenario for me. But our magnetic pull is always get out in the field and talk to folks, and that's what our folks want to do, frankly. So in terms of the new technology, it wasn't so much a new technology. Again, I go back to DeGero, and we also deal with a couple other vendors. But if I had to do my favorite vendors throughout the whole thing, who I couldn't live with, you didn't ask me this question, but I'll answer it anyway. My favorite vendors would be Sony, Apple, and DeGero, and I'm sorry, LiveU. But without them, we would not have been able to do anything. And I guess that kind of answers your question in terms of connectivity. Connectivity is now, once this, I've said this before, we've hit a mature level on this. We're trying to figure out constantly, even in the New York area, what's the best way to make sure our folks in the field have the best strength to deal with. And we're finding, surprisingly, along the line, you could have well, this isn't surprising me, but 5G, you could have something that says I think 5G is a marketing scam at this point. In fact, we turn it off. It's and I've had that conversation. That's another conversation for NAB. If anybody's going to be out there, we could talk about it out there. 5G just doesn't work, and it wasn't intended for it. But anyway, 4G is fine. But we could find that our connectivity issue is actually in our building, that maybe we're being throttled with a VPN in the building. So we could have the greatest strength in the world, but iNews is failing, or sorry to have it, or we just can't work off a Stratus and things like that. So that's our biggest challenge right now. One of the reasons I came here today was to see if, in talking to all you folks and listen to my colleagues up here, how other folks are doing it. Has someone come up with something better? Because there's about 50 different methodologies out there right now, and some work and some don't.
Okay, fair. Eric, have you found that for the home studio setups or remote contributor subs, have you had to upgrade anyone's home broadband, or is basic broadband that your employees or other sources had good enough for what you do day to day?
I think we learned quickly back in March of 2020 how poor some of our home our employees'
Absolutely.
internet systems are. So the answer is yes. We've most definitely had to upgrade them, or they've upgraded themselves, because our employees want to be part of the solution, and so we've helped them where needed. But clearly, it whether it be traditional ISPs or we're still relying on cellular in some places, or at least bonded cellular in some places, because that's better than what they can get at their home location. So we continue to hope for better days with 5G as well, but certainly not something that we can rely on right now. So yeah, we are continuing to support those at home with what they need.
Just real quick, we had to have the head of Cablevision drag a line about a half mile up to Lonnie Quinn's weather barn because he had no connectivity at all. And so Jeff Birch, our head of ops, he knows everybody. And literally that's what happened. The head of Cablevision Connecticut up in Westport, Connecticut, found the closest line and dragged it. And that's how we broadcast for probably a good 6 months.
Well, I'm sure he's a good customer.
Yeah. He knows people.
Jacques, your perspective, obviously, you guys are affiliated with a cable company. Have you upgraded broadband for any of the people working from home, or the weather talent you mentioned?
Yeah, look, we've had to do the same thing everybody on this panel's had to do. It's the backgrounds, it's the audio, it's the capability to generate graphics. It's so yeah, little by little, we've gotten there, and I think we're at the same point now. It's like, all right, we've got all this infrastructure in people's homes. We don't use it as much now since people have returned, to the studio. So are we going to, where will this be a year from now? I think that's really the telling point. How much of this really lasts as part of our future workflow, and how much of it will we just remember as, a monumental disruptor that taught us a few things that we've, inculcated in how we do daily workflow. I don't know anybody that, can predict that quite yet. But again, the flexibility that I think it gives people, broadcasters to immediately get news on the air, is unquestionable. And I think it's made our staffs more nimble.
I definitely think that we're going to see a lot of it retained. And on our end, the benefits are there from a live production perspective from home. Maybe that'll change again, more back to the studio to all of your points. But also from a production perspective, from an editing perspective, I think that's going to continue. And we already are starting to see some of the benefits of being able to find people in other parts of the country to do editing work and other things for us. And of course, the same questions come into play. Do they have the right internet? And yeah, we've done the same thing, of course, upgrading different folks' internet connections and things like that. But I think that's going to be also the next, coming back to what I said earlier, also about the flexibility and that accessibility. We are totally committed to continuing that and enabling those things where we can work with people across the world to do certain production functions.
Right, because it broadens your available talent pool.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
We have just a couple minutes left. Are there any questions from our audience here? Got a lot of brain power up here on the dais. Anyone?
Yeah, one of the gentlemen, I think from ABC, talked about VDI, I think was referenced in the call. So I'd love it if you could tell me a little bit about the decision to go that direction versus a sort of SaaS native direction in terms of editing and production workflows.
No, great question. I mean, so for me, and I don't want to speak, there's different opinions, I think, about it, but I would love to continue seeing a path towards SaaS and doing cloud native. And obviously, I talked about our hybrid environment of being able to run the applications natively. I think that's the ideal. But in our current reality, we have a lot of applications, obviously low latency applications, things that have to work very well together. So if you're doing live production or you're doing immediate graphic, overlays, and largely our editing environment still is this way as well, it makes more sense to have those be running on compute and storage that's more managed by us, and then access that via the VDI solution. So that's also a current state scenario where we're not quite where we want to be with these other layers I mentioned earlier, and certainly for our new building, that's where we're headed. So it's I think right now a little bit of a go-between to be able to enable these low latency remote access productions. Where we're planning to go is that we're going to continue to build out that VDI environment and at least focus there on making that as cohesive as possible so that everything that we need is in that environment. A producer can log in once into that VDI session and do everything they need to do so that we don't have a scenario like we have had in the past where you log into VDI to do your Avid editing and one other thing, but you still have to have a separate session to do your email. Right? And that's where it comes back to the networking, having that all interconnected. So the idea right now is you log into VDI, you can do everything you need to do. The future goal is to probably get away from that and be able to do it more natively.
Okay. Just time for just one more question. Jock, could you talk a little bit about some of the OTT initiatives that News 12 has been pursuing? And I think you mentioned that business had kind of taken off during the pandemic.
I've never seen anything like it. I mean, I've never seen any sort of business model where the growth is as hockey stick as OTT. And it's to the point where, and it's, in our case, we produce so much content. We have 7 newsrooms in the New York area, right? And we produce so much, our hundreds of people produce so much content that it's, it's just grab the best stuff from 7 regions all day long and pump it out to an audience. And it's been a monumental success content-wise. It's been a monumental success on the 9 platforms that we're pumping out every day. And we sit there and look at ourselves every day and go, when have we ever seen anything, in our history where the consumption has, has been the way this is? I mean, it is truly vertical every single month. Every single month, there are hundreds, there are hundreds of thousands of minutes and millions of minutes that people are watching this more than they did before. So as a cable company, like, we like this because as you look at where we are with cable and subs continue to go down, but you look at where you are with OTT, which is, again, you know, it's hockey stick. I think the melding of those two will help make this transition, you know, a lot smoother as we evolve the kind of platforms that people are going to have to use to, you know, consume news.
Okay, thanks. I think we're time. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank my panelists for a great discussion. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.